Room 14 hides a secret no one dares to speak. Welcome to Inspector Morse. I am your host, Hawthorne. Drop a comment with your theories. I can't wait to see where everyone is tuning in from. Let's uncover the truth. The canal had that dull, pewter sheen one associates with late autumn evenings, when the rain has been falling long enough to erase all colour, but not quite long enough to cleanse anything. I had been watching it from a corner table at the Jericho Tavern, my head still heavy from the previous night's indiscretions with a bottle of Lafroy, and the crossword on the bar counter offered only the mildest consolation. 7 across demanded some forgotten monarch, and 11 down wanted a synonym for exile, which seemed to me too cruelly personal a word for a Friday evening. The air was warm with the smell of hops, tobacco still clinging faintly to the curtains from a decade before, and the gentle clink of glasses provided its own monotonous counterpoint to my thoughts. I recall thinking, with that peculiar self-pity which comes easily to a man alone, that one could measure a life in empty pint glasses as faithfully as in birthdays. It was then that a snatch of conversation drifted across from the other side of the bar. 2 men in cheap suits, their collars too tight, speaking more to fill the silence than for the joy of hearing one another. One said something about the Randolph, about how the place had a certain fading grandeur, and then, half muffled by the scrape of a chair, the other muttered a phrase that caught me despite myself: the widow who keeps to herself in room 14. I did not raise my head, only noted the words in that quiet way detectives do when they have long ago lost the energy to be surprised. A widow? A room number? A peculiar self-containment. The imagination fills in too quickly, of course, conjuring pale hands, an untouched breakfast tray, curtains that never open. But I let it go. Too many ghosts wander Oxford's hotels for one to chase each of them. The crossword offered itself again. Widow's mite, perhaps? 7 letters. I toyed with charity, rejected it, sipped my pint, and watched the rain coil down the window pane as though it too sought some solution. Outside, Broad Street shimmered with wet cobblestones. Bicycles leaned against railings, the spires of St. Michael's dissolving into mist. Students hurried by in coats too thin for the season, clutching books to their chests like shields against the weather. I envied their urgency. My own steps had grown slower, as though the years themselves had conspired to thicken the pavements beneath me. A barmaid asked, without enthusiasm, whether I'd like another, and I heard myself agree. Perhaps it was the drink that loosened memory, for I found myself thinking of a woman I had once known, too briefly, too carelessly, who had stayed once at the Randolph. She had written me a postcard from room 12, complaining about the tea and praising the view, a foolish thing to remember perhaps, but memory is a treacherous servant, pulling forward details we would prefer to leave buried. The men at the bar had gone when I next looked up. Only their half-drunk pints remained, a thin scum of foam clinging to the edges. I thought of following, of asking about their mysterious widow, but the thought expired before it reached my legs. Some mysteries resist urgency, and one learns, painfully, inevitably, that a little patience often reveals more than pursuit. And so I remained, brooding over Don, over exile, over the faintly misquoted lines that sometimes echo through half-remembered conversations. My pencil hovered over the crossword's empty squares. 7 across remained obstinate, as did the silence of the rain. I left only when the pub began to thin, when the landlord extinguished one of the lamps, leaving the far wall in shadow. Outside, the drizzle had turned to proper rain. I pulled my coat tighter, turned toward the dim lights of Beaumont Street, and told myself, with unconvincing finality, that the widow of room 14 was no concern of mine. Yet, even now, I know the words had lodged themselves. Like a burr in the mind's fabric, small and irritating, but certain never to fall away of their own accord. Lewis rang early, though I was hardly awake to receive it. His voice carried that mix of duty and diffidence that so marked him. There had been a death at the Randolph, he said. A woman, late 60s, registered under the name Mrs. Elspeth Carrow. Would I come? I found myself agreeing, though the thought of a hotel room in mid-morning light held little appeal. By the time I arrived, the drizzle had settled into a thin, colourless mist that clung to the windows and blurred the outlines of St. John's across the way. Inside, the Randolph smelled of polish and overused carpet cleaner. The receptionist spoke in hushed tones as though the very corridors might betray her indiscretion. "Room 14, she whispered, as though the number itself contained a curse. Lewis was waiting outside the door. He reported the facts with military economy. The maid had entered at 9, found the curtains drawn, the guest unresponsive, the bedside littered with an opened bottle of sleeping tablets. A letter, half-written, addressed but unsent. He looked at me expectantly, as though I might already divine the truth before stepping inside. The room was heavy with the stale perfume of confinement. On the bed lay Mrs. Carrow, her face pale, her lips faintly parted. There was a dignity in her stillness that suggested deliberate exit rather than accident. The pills by the bedside, the water glass, the letter, all these offered a narrative almost too willing to be believed. Yet my eyes, trained by long habit to distrust simplicity, caught on something smaller. The curtains. They were drawn firmly across, but one corner revealed a pale sliver of daylight where the fabric failed to meet. The maid insisted she had left them wide open the previous afternoon. People forget such things, of course, but her insistence bore that peculiar intensity of the genuinely certain. I filed it away. Lewis showed me the letter. Written in a careful, looping hand, it began with an apology that trailed into unfinished phrases. "Forgive me," it said, "though I doubt you ever will. What happened in Oxford that summer?" The pen stroke ended abruptly, the ink darkening where the nib had lingered too long. No name, no date, no explanation. Just absence. I wandered to the bedside table. A book of poetry lay open, Don's sermons and verses bound in faded cloth. One line had been underlined with unusual force. "Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful." But the words were wrong. The text in that edition rendered it not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. Yet the line beneath bore an error, a substitution too deliberate to be chance. It troubled me more than the pills, more than the unfinished letter. To misquote Don is no great crime, but it speaks of attention. Someone had read this line, marked it, and altered it in memory or intention. And language, in my experience, is rarely innocent. Lewis watched me from the doorway, shuffling awkwardly. He asked if I thought it suicide. I told him it might be, though the words came out with less conviction than he deserved. He nodded, grateful for even that much certainty, and I saw the question forming in his mind. Why the curtains? Why the book? Why the insistence on these trifles? I did not answer. Some details must be allowed to settle before they reveal their shape. Outside the window the mist pressed close against the glass, as if eager to enter. Oxford's spires loomed faintly, their outlines softened, their histories muffled. A city of silences, of secrets folded into the very fabric of its stone. I left the Randolph with the image of a pale hand resting on a bedspread and the faint scratch of Don's words misrendered in ink. And as I stepped into the wet air of Beaumont Street, I knew, with the kind of knowledge one never admits aloud, that the widow of Roe the Randolph, for all its varnished respectability, has always struck me as a place of masks. The lobby smells faintly of furniture polish and boiled cabbage, and in that air of faded grandeur one finds the curious comfort of anonymity. Yet it is precisely in such places that secrets gather, unspoken but palpable, like the dust that collects on unused piano keys. Lewis handed me the guest list, his finger tapping each name with the earnestness of a schoolboy. I recall his quiet certainty that lists, properly examined, should yield answers. My own view was less sanguine. Names conceal as much as they reveal, and the truest parts of people seldom appear in ink. Dr. Marcus Vale, where I met first, in the lounge, hunched over a glass of whisky at an hour when coffee would have been more defensible. He was a classics man from one of the smaller colleges, and his face bore that distinctive mix of intelligence and failure which Oxford produces in such abundance. He greeted me with a flourish of Latin, slightly misquoted, I noticed, though I let it pass, and proceeded to assure me of his long acquaintance with Mrs. Carrow. A gentlewoman, he called her, though the word seemed drawn from an older century. His eyes, however, betrayed something closer to need. "Debt," whispered the lines at his temples, and the restless twitch of his fingers along the rim of his glass confirmed it. Miss Catherine Ashwell was quite another matter. She had the unyielding composure of a woman who has long accepted the narrowness of her own life and constructed within it a fortress of small refinements. A piano teacher, she told me, and unmarried, though the latter hardly required telling. She spoke warmly of Mrs. Carrow, almost too warmly as though rehearsed. Yet in one unguarded moment her gaze flickered towards the door of room 14 with a force of recognition that struck me more powerfully than her carefully chosen words. She asked, almost absently, whether the curtains had been drawn when the body was found. I asked how she knew, and she flushed, murmuring something about gossip among the staff. I made no reply, but noted it. Julian Arkwright, solicitor, widower, carried himself with a certain pompous ease that solicitors seem to cultivate. He was courteous to the point of self-satisfaction, assuring me he was only too happy to assist in the inquiry. I asked whether he had known Mrs. Carrow well, and he smiled in a manner that suggested fondness, though not of a sort one would admit openly. He had the look of a man too accustomed to the company of younger women, the cut of his suit, the faint scent of cologne. There was something faintly predatory about the way his gaze lingered on the barmaid as she passed. When I asked whether he had spoken with the deceased in her final days, he claimed only polite exchanges in the lounge. Yet the way he reached for his cufflink as he answered told me he was hiding more. And then Sister Miriam. The incongruity of a nun at the Randolph struck me, though Oxford has long been home to such paradoxes. She wore her habit with a severity that resisted curiosity. I asked what brought her to the city, and she offered only that she was researching in the Bodleian. When pressed further, she looked at me with eyes of such calm opacity that I felt almost chastened. She claimed not to have known Mrs. Carrow at all, though the hesitation before the denial betrayed otherwise. Her hands clasped on her lap bore no tremor, but the stillness was itself suspicious. Silence can be as telling as confession. They gathered in the lounge that evening, the four of them, each pretending indifference while their eyes betrayed the delicate triangulations of memory and concealment. Vale stared into his glass as though it held the ruins of his fortunes. Ashwell thumbed absent-mindedly at a sheet of music paper, though she could not read in the dim light. Arkwright fussed with his watch chain, checking it too often for the hour. Miriam sat apart, her gaze lowered, her lips moving silently as though in prayer. I sat among them, feigning casualness, and worked at a crossword from the Times. The clue was 10 across, a gathering of the faithful, 9 letters. I filled in conclave, and as I did so, I felt the irony tighten in my chest, for that was precisely what we were, a conclave of the faithful, each loyal to some past they dared not name. The widow of room 14 had left behind her silence, and in that silence each of them seemed already guilty. Ohm 14 had not written her final chapter alone. The belongings of the dead are always deceptive. A life seems reducible to a suitcase, a few dresses pressed flat, some letters, a faded photograph or two. Yet, in those meagre possessions there often lies a density of meaning greater than the life itself. Mrs. Carrow had packed with the care of a woman who intended to stay only briefly. One suitcase, modest, its brass clasp slightly bent, a handbag with lipstick the colour of old roses, and a handful of papers scattered across the writing desk. It was Lewis who discovered the letter. He handed it to me as though it were dangerous, and in its way it was. The page was half filled in an elegant sloping hand. "You must forgive me, though I doubt you ever will. What happened in Oxford that summer?" And there the words ceased, mid-sentence, mid-thought, as if silence had claimed the pen. No name, no address, no signature, only the ghost of a confession without a recipient. I read it twice, and then again, searching for the pressure of intent between the strokes of ink. Forgive me. It implied guilt. But guilt directed at whom? The summer in Oxford, a phrase heavy with personal history, yet light enough to vanish into ambiguity. I asked Lewis what he made of it. He suggested an affair, some old scandal. His pragmatism is enviable, but it misses the subtle contours that interest me most. A half-finished letter tells us less of what was meant than of what could not be said. I questioned Miss Ashwell later that morning. She sat at the piano in the lounge, her fingers drifting absently across the keys. When I mentioned the letter, she stiffened, though she feigned ignorance. She spoke warmly of Mrs. Carrow, describing her as kind, thoughtful, delicate in health. Yet when I asked her how long she had known the widow, she answered, "Since 1972, then quickly corrected herself. 1973, perhaps. The kind of correction too hurried to be entirely honest. I let her words lie, but the music of her voice betrayed a deeper chord. Dr. Vale, by contrast, seemed positively delighted by the drama. He quoted Horace clumsily about the brevity of life and hinted that the letter might concern money. He had the look of a man who wished to appear in the narrative, even if only on its periphery. His whisky glass smelled faintly of the morning, and I thought again of the unpaid bills that must have dogged his steps like creditors of the soul. Arkwright the solicitor proved more evasive. When asked if he had seen Mrs. Carrow writing anything, he replied too quickly, "No, never, not to his knowledge." His hands, however, fussed with his cuff-link in that same nervous pattern I had observed before. The body may betray what the tongue denies. And then Sister Miriam. She listened with extraordinary stillness, as though the words were not meant for her, but for some higher ear. When I asked if she had ever known Mrs. Carrow in her earlier years, she paused for so long that I almost believed she had not heard. Finally she said, "God knows her secrets better than we." It was an evasion wrapped in piety, and I felt certain she was concealing more than she revealed. Back in my rooms that evening, I studied the letter again. The paper bore the hotel's crest in gold at the top, yet the indentation of a previous page could just be discerned if held to the light. Some earlier note had pressed faintly into the fibres, an echo of absent words. My pencil, shaded across the surface, revealed fragments. Oxford, shame, never again. Not enough to reconstruct a sentence, but sufficient to suggest intensity. I turned to the crossword, seeking distraction. The clue was 4 down, unfinished business, 5 letters. I wrote in debt, then reconsidered and replaced it with guilt. Both fitted, and both belonged to the widow of room 14. The letter without a name lay beside me, silent, incomplete. And in its silence I heard the first whispers of something older, something that had waited decades for a conclusion it would never willingly surrender. The detective's curse is not the absence of clues, but their profusion. Too many loose threads can knot themselves into a false pattern, and one learns, though always too late, that the mind is eager to invent symmetry where none exists. So it was with Mrs. Carrow's torn note. Lewis had found it in the waste bin, its edges ragged, its meaning half concealed. It read only, "Unless the sum is paid at once, I shall have no choice." The rest was missing, though the menace was clear enough. Blackmail is Oxford's oldest currency. I held the fragment beneath the desk lamp, running my thumb along the tear. The ink had smudged faintly, as if written in haste, or with hands not entirely steady. When I asked Dr. Vale about it, he laughed too loudly, a scholar's laugh meant to disguise discomfort. He admitted, almost proudly, that he was drowning in debt. Bookmakers, not banks, he clarified with drunken precision. I wondered whether he meant me to believe he had threatened the widow, or whether he was merely deflecting suspicion through over-confession. The classics had taught him that tragedy often lay in hubris, but he seemed determined to play the part regardless. Arkwright was subtler. He denied any knowledge of the note, but his denial was so practiced it had the polish of routine. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that Mrs. Carrow had revised her will only weeks before, a fact he offered without prompting, as though it might distract me from the more personal nature of the blackmail. Yet it struck me as odd that a solicitor should volunteer such information so readily, unless he wished to shape the course of my suspicion. Miss Ashwell grew pale when I spoke of the torn note. She insisted Mrs. Carrow was incapable of harbouring secrets, let alone debts. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and though her loyalty was convincing, it seemed too absolute, the way a devout parishioner defends the virtue of a priest. When pressed further, she deflected, asking instead if I had discovered anything in the letter on the writing desk. It was a strange inversion, the accused questioning the detective, and Sister Miriam, who listened with eyes lowered, said only that money was a worldly chain, and that perhaps Mrs. Carrow had sought release from it. She spoke with the certainty of a woman who had renounced the world yet still carried within her the world's memory. I left her with the impression of an anchor disguised as an oracle. The shape of the case by then seemed to resolve itself. A widow with a past, a note of blackmail, a classics lecturer desperate enough to grasp at any straw, a solicitor guarding a will like a miser his coin, and a woman at the piano who loved too fiercely to see clearly. All the lines pointed to debt and desperation. Suicide, perhaps hastened by the cruelties of others. Yet even as I allowed myself the comfort of this neat construction, a detail gnawed. The phrasing of the torn note did not match Vale's manner of speaking. I'd heard him stumble through Horace and stammer through excuses, yet the cadence of "unless the sum is paid at once" bore none of his verbal untidiness. The law spoke in that register, not the lecture hall. Still, I let the false picture linger a while. There is an odd solace in red herrings. They offer the illusion of completion, the satisfaction of believing one has arrived, even when the destination is false. Lewis, faithful as ever, suggested we had the answer already, blackmail leading to despair. I nodded, allowing him the comfort of certainty, though my own thoughts remained unsettled. That evening, I returned to the crossword. 8 down. Deception, 8 letters. I tried falsehood, but it refused to fit. I settled on red herring, though the missing final letter mocked me. A pattern almost right, but not entirely, much like the case itself. And in the stillness of my room, with rain whispering against the window, I wondered whether Mrs. Carrow's death had less to do with money than with memory. It is an odd thing how language betrays us. A man may compose his alibi with exquisite care, but one stray verb, one misplaced emphasis, and the truth peeks through like light beneath a closed door. I have long trusted words more than witnesses, and so it was with Mrs. Carrow's death, the words refusing to settle into any comfortable shape. The coroner's report had arrived. Overdose, though not quite enough to still all doubt. The dosage, they said, might have killed a weaker woman, but Mrs. Carrow was not weak. I pictured her in the Randolph lounge, shoulders drawn back, eyes that had known both sorrow and survival. A woman like that did not stumble into death as one might trip on a loose paving stone. If she had chosen it, she had chosen deliberately. Yet the torn note continued to whisper a different story. Lewis brought the matter up again, over coffee too bitter for its porcelain cup. He said perhaps we should pursue Vale, that the man's gambling debts were sufficient motive for anything. I told him the note did not sound like Vale, and Lewis shrugged, as though to suggest that desperation could borrow eloquence when it needed to. But I could not shake the feeling that the rhythm of the words belonged to someone trained in careful phrasing, someone for whom precision was both habit and weapon. The crossword that evening was from the Times. 6 across. Contradiction, 11 letters. I tried inconsistent, and it fit snugly. It amused me how the puzzle seemed to echo my case, as though the setter had entered into some private conspiracy with me. The contradictions in our suspects were plentiful. Vale had confessed too easily, flaunting his vices with theatrical despair. Arkwright had dissembled with the polish of a man accustomed to lies, yet betrayed himself by offering information no one had sought. Miss Ashwell had defended her friend with the zeal of faith, yet redirected my questions with a swiftness born not of innocence but of practice. And Sister Miriam, who seemed least concerned with earthly matters, had still chosen her words with an almost legal caution. Contradictions all, as if the Randolph had become a stage upon which everyone played a role faintly askew. I revisited the scene in room 14, the curtains again. The maid insisted she had left them open to let the afternoon sun cleanse the air, yet I had found them drawn, heavy velvet pressing the room into twilight. Why would a dying woman choose to dim her last sight of the world, unless someone else had wished her death to be discovered in shadow rather than light? The book of poetry remained on the bedside table, John Donne, with the underlined line still troubling me. The misquotation was subtle, one word altered, transforming resignation into something sterner. Not, "No man is an island entire of itself," but instead, "No man is island entire of itself." The omission of an article, small enough to be dismissed yet suggestive of haste, or of a hand unfamiliar with the text. Mrs. Carrow, who had studied literature at Somerville in her youth, would not have stumbled there. Someone else had marked the page. Lewis thought me fanciful when I said so. Perhaps she, underlined in haste, he offered, or perhaps her hand trembled from the pills. I could not answer him directly, for he was not wrong, only incomplete. What unsettled me was not the possibility of error, but the manner of it. a subtle change that altered the very meaning of Don's meditation, from communal belonging to solitary exile, a widow's loneliness given harsher outline. I felt then the blackmail note begin to loosen its hold on the narrative I had built. Too convenient, too legible. Real threats seldom announce themselves so tidily. If Mrs. Carrow had enemies, they would have cloaked their demands with ambiguity, not presented them in language fit for a courtroom. And if she had allies, they would not have allowed her to vanish in silence. Contradictions everywhere. A scholar who spoke like a debtor, a solicitor who lied like a priest, a nun who reasoned like a lawyer, a music teacher who sounded like a lover. And behind them all, the quiet figure of a widow who may have been neither victim nor suicide, but something else entirely. As I left the hotel that night, rain falling with a patience all its own, I glanced at the Randolph's illuminated windows. Behind each curtain, a guest rehearsing a story, trimming it, polishing it, until it gleamed with plausibility. Yet the truth, like an untidy crossword clue, remained stubborn, resisting neat solution. I walked home with Don's line echoing faintly in my head. No man is island, and I wondered who had chosen to mar the text, Mrs. Carrow herself, or the hand that had closed the curtains. There is something about a chapel at night that disarms even the most sceptical among us. Not faith precisely, I have never claimed such a luxury, but a stillness, a hush that convinces the restless mind it has entered a space where secrets might be spoken more softly than lies. The Randolph small chapel was barely larger than a library anteroom. A narrow aisle, a row of benches, a crucifix above an altar that bore the faint polish of a caretaker's cloth. It smelt faintly of candle wax and damp stone, as though Oxford itself had exhaled within those walls. I found Sister Miriam seated near the front, her veil outlined by the flame she had lit. She greeted me with the serenity of one who expected intrusion. I sat beside her without invitation. We did not speak at once. Silence, like incense, has its own weight. At last, she said she had been praying for the soul of Mrs. Carrow. It was not unusual, I suppose, for a nun to pray for the dead. Yet there was something in the way she said her name, not with piety, but with a kind of mournful intimacy. I asked if she had known the widow well. Sister Miriam smiled thinly as if the question had been rehearsed. She had met her only a handful of times, she said, but felt drawn to her, a woman of grief, and therefore a woman of God's special attention. I did not contradict her. Still, I noticed the candle. A thick ivory taper burned, lower than one evening could account for. The wax had dripped in uneven rivulets, as though it had been lit again and again, far longer than the nun had been seated there. Lewis would have called it nothing. I saw instead a devotion that outlasted chance acquaintance. She asked whether I believed Mrs. Carrow had chosen her death. I told her the evidence leaned both ways. The nun nodded as if such ambiguity were natural, even holy. Death, she murmured, rarely arrives as one expects it. Some invite it, some resist it, and some merely accept the door when it opens. Her words lingered, shaped not by dogma but by lived sorrow. I wondered then what grief Sister Miriam carried, for she spoke not like one who ministered to others, but like one who had wrestled long with her own absence. I pressed her, lightly, about the day of the widow's death. She admitted she had been in the Randolph that afternoon, though she claimed no more than chance. Visiting Oxford for business with the diocese, she said, and the Randolph had a chapel she could not ignore. Her tone was measured, but her hands betrayed her. She clasped them tightly, thumbs worrying one another, as if to keep her story neat. The candle's flame trembled in the draught. I asked whether she had spoken with Mrs. Carrow that day. Sister Miriam paused, too long for comfort, before answering no. Yet the hesitation was an answer in itself. When pressed further, she said only that a nun's duty is sometimes to listen, even when words are never uttered aloud. There was the crossword clue again, contradiction. A nun who admitted nothing yet implied too much. A guest who professed accident yet lingered in the widow's chapel. When I rose to leave, she touched my arm gently. "Inspector," she said, "do not mistake silence for concealment. Sometimes silence is the only honest language we have." It was the sort of phrase one might dismiss as piety. Yet I felt, in that instant, She was speaking less as a sister of the church and more as a woman who feared that words, if spoken, would bind her to a truth she could not endure. I left her there with her candle. Oxford's rain tapped faintly at the chapel's stained-glass window, refracting the flame into fragments of colour on the stone floor, and I could not help but wonder whether the light she tended belonged to the soul of Mrs. Carrow or to her own. Rain will always sound different when heard through hotel glass, not the wildness of weather on rooftops or the solemn percussion on cathedral stone, but a muffled, hesitant patter, as though the world beyond is being played in half measure. That evening, as I walked the Randolphs' corridor towards the lounge, I heard that sound and thought of piano keys, struck too softly to carry their melody. It was Catherine Ashwell who entered my mind even before I saw her. She sat by the lounge window, alone, her posture severe and composed, like a figure carved into oak. A cup of tea had long since cooled at her elbow. I asked whether the seat beside her was taken. She inclined her head in that schoolmistress fashion that meant both yes and no. She did not offer condolences for the widow's death, nor did she feign surprise that I wished to speak with her. Instead, she asked if I liked music. I told her I did, though I could play little myself beyond the listening ear. She nodded as though I had confirmed a suspicion. Music, she said, was not a pastime but a discipline, the kind of discipline most people lacked. It was said not with pride, but with something sharper, as if every false note in her pupils had been endured like a personal injury. I asked about Mrs. Carrow. Catherine's eyes did not move from the window. She was a woman, she said at last, who longed for company but rarely admitted the depth of her loneliness. That was why, Catherine claimed, she sometimes joined her in the lounge for tea. Not friendship exactly, companionship, of a careful, guarded kind. I sensed it was as close to tenderness as she could articulate. She spoke little else of the widow. When I pressed her, she replied that people are never wholly what they show. The remark might have been directed at Mrs. Carrow, or at herself. I could not be certain. Lewis had said earlier that Miss Ashwell struck him as brittle, and he was right. But there was also something precise in her language, as though every word were weighed against disclosure. When I asked where she had been the evening of Mrs. Carrow's death, she answered with perfect calm, teaching until 7, supper alone in her room afterwards, then a book until she slept. It was the sort of account that seemed airtight until one noticed the silence within it. I asked what book she had been reading. Her lips tightened. She could not remember. That was the crack, almost invisible, yet enough to catch the mind. On the low table beside her sat a crossword half completed, the Times folded neatly in squares. The clues attempted were those of literature, languages, music, the scientific ones untouched. But one answer caught my eye, a clue requiring a 6-letter word for a widow's lament. She had written threnos, the ancient Greek form, though the correct answer had been elegy. An error or a display? Few outside classics would have chosen that word. I recalled Dr. Vale, a man who swam in debt and whiskey and Greek alike. A shared interest, perhaps, or a shared conversation. I asked if she had spoken often with Vale. She said no, too quickly. Then, softening, admitted that Oxford drew people of similar disciplines together, whether they wished it or not. A strange way to phrase an acquaintance. The rain grew heavier, the lights within the lounge a muted amber. Catherine at last turned towards me, her eyes dark and steady. "Inspector," she said, "some lives are written in silence. If you press too hard, you will hear nothing at all." It was not a plea, but a warning. She rose, leaving her cold tea untouched, and walked from the room with that same rigid poise with which she had arrived. I remained looking at her crossword. A widow's lament misanswered. A silence maintained like discipline. In music, a rest is as deliberate as a note. In Catherine Ashwell, the silence was. There are men whose very presence seems lacquered, polished until no trace of blemish remains. And Julian Arkwright belonged to that order. He was a widower of some years, though one would not have guessed it from his manner. The lounge suited him, the deep chairs, the muted fire, the kind of evening whisky that glowed like an old cathedral window. He carried his glass with the care of a man accustomed to ceremony. Lewis had said earlier, with quiet disdain, that Arkwright flirted with the younger waitresses. I believed him. There was a certain hunger beneath the polished veneer, the sort that regards charm as both shield and weapon. When I joined him, he smiled too readily, and asked if I drank. I answered that I did, but not always in company. He laughed, though the sound was more performance than amusement. We spoke first of the widow. He described her with the bland sympathy of a solicitor reciting a case file. A good woman, he said, kind but fragile, the kind who needed reassurance. He had seen her once or twice about the lounge. Never in confidence, but always, he insisted, she seemed glad of a little attention. I found the words too neat, the edges smoothed like the glass in his hand. I asked where he had been on the evening of her death. He leaned back, the amber liquid shifting gently with the motion. Dining late, he said, in company of an old friend who could vouch for him. I asked the friend's name. He hesitated only a fraction, then supplied it, a retired banker in Banbury. Lewis made a note, though I saw from the corner of my eye the faintest tremor in Arkwright's hand. Not nerves, perhaps, but calculation. The thing about polished men is that they forget polish leaves residue. On the table beside him lay a slim volume of poetry. Not Donne this time, but Herrick. Arkwright remarked that he liked the wit of the Cavaliers, the lighter turn of verse. I asked if he had spoken with Mrs. Carrow about poetry. He frowned slightly, as though the suggestion touched a nerve. He claimed not. Yet the book's margin bore a pencilled note, not in his hand, I would have wagered, beneath the line, "Gather ye rosebuds while ye may." A woman's script, delicate but firm. I wondered whose rosebuds had been gathered, and at what cost. Arkwright changed subject with lawyerly ease, asking if the investigation was progressing. I told him investigations seldom progress in straight lines. He smiled again, but his eyes remained cool, detached, almost rehearsed. Lewis excused himself to check a minor detail, leaving me alone with the solicitor. Arkwright lowered his voice. "Inspector, you must understand, grief makes women seek companionship in strange places." The remark hung in the air like cigar. Smoke! Faintly offensive, impossible to grasp cleanly. Did he mean Mrs. Carrow had sought him out, or that Catherine Ashwell had? His ambiguity was deliberate, a tactic familiar to any man who had spent decades in the law. I watched him lift his glass, the gold liquid glinting. His cufflink caught the firelight. A trivial detail, yet I noticed the engraving. Initials, not his own. A woman's, perhaps. Trinkets tell stories, words conceal. When he finished, he placed the glass carefully upon the table, no trace of spillage left behind. But as he rose, I noted the faintest smear of lipstick on the rim, not the kind one acquires alone. He must have seen my glance, for he said, with that polished composure, "Good evening, Inspector," and left without hurry. The fire crackled. The empty glass remained, a silent witness more candid than its owner. In its reflection I saw the truth about Julian Arkwright. A man of polish, yes, but polish conceals more than it reveals, and sometimes it betrays. Beginning to speak, it was Lewis who found her first, kneeling not in prayer but in quiet observation at the edge of the hotel's chapel. The Randolph, in its attempt to please every guest, had maintained a small room with wooden pews and a simple crucifix, the air forever scented with polish and candle wax. There she was, Sister Miriam, her face caught in the shadows, her lips moving as if rehearsing words rather than offering them to heaven. I have never been a religious man. Whatever faith I once entertained had long since been eroded by logic, disappointment, and the merciless company of facts. Yet there was something in the figure of that nun, composed yet faintly strained, that made me pause. Lewis said she would not answer him at first, merely gestured for patience. At length she rose. Her eyes, when they settled on me, did not possess the clarity I expected. They were watchful, yes, but watchful in the way of one who fears more than she hopes. She spoke softly, her accent carrying a hint of Ireland, though smoothed by years of restraint. She had come, she said, for research at the Bodleian. Church records, letters of long-dead clerics, matters of doctrine and conscience. It might have ended there, a nun in Oxford pursuing some obscure ecclesiastical study. Yet the world is never so obliging. For her name had been seen more than once on the guest register of the widow's room. When I asked if she had known Mrs. Carrow, her reply was a careful one. We spoke, she said, now and then. She was a woman in need of guidance. Guidance, I asked, in matters spiritual. Miriam's lips thinned. Guidance, Inspector, takes many forms. The air in the chapel felt heavy. Rain pressed faintly at the stained glass windows, the colours subdued, as though reluctant to intrude upon our conversation. Lewis, uneasy with such opacity, scribbled notes while I watched her fingers. She carried no rosary, though her hands seemed trained to hold one. They rested on the pew in front of her, pale and nervous, as if each question chipped away at a wall she had constructed around herself. I asked why she travelled alone. Most nuns, I thought, move in pairs or remain with their orders. She looked away, toward the crucifix. Sometimes, Inspector, solitude is the greater obedience. There was a silence then, filled only by the distant clatter of crockery from the dining room below. I could not resist an old habit. I remarked on the crossword clue I had struggled with that morning, a 6-letter word meaning refuge. Her reply was swift. Asylum. She did not smile. Perhaps it was no coincidence. Lewis asked directly whether she had been in the widow's room on the night of the death. Her denial came without pause, though not without weight. I had been here, she said, in this chapel praying for her. There was no one to confirm it. She offered no proof. And yet, there was a detail. On the desk in Mrs. Carrow's room beside the Book of Donne, a folded scrap of paper had been found. A psalm, written in the same small, spare script as the pencilled margin in Herrick. Though the handwriting had not been compared officially, I carried the image in my head, and it pressed itself forward now as Sister Miriam spoke. She must have seen something in my eyes, for she added, almost defensively, I told her to prepare herself. Not for death, but for truth. Some truths cannot be carried alone. It was not an admission, nor a confession, more like a shadow that hints at the body casting it. When she left, the chapel felt emptier, though the pews had not moved. Lewis muttered that he did not trust her. I said nothing. Distrust was too blunt a word. She was a figure both earnest and evasive, like a hymn sung half under breath. Later that night I looked again at the scrap of psalm. I noticed a single letter overwritten, as though corrected in haste, a habit perhaps of one accustomed to silence but not to ink, the kind of detail one sees only when the rain falls long enough against the glass, and the mind has nothing left to do but remember. Memory is a peculiar thing. It does not arrive neatly like a letter in the post, but in fragments, shadows, and the faintest echoes. Catherine Ashwell's recollections of Mrs. Carrow were such fragments, each delicate, each incomplete, yet revealing more than she intended. I found her in the lounge again, seated at the upright piano, fingers hovering over keys she did not press. The instrument was silent, yet I could sense her music lingering in the room. She looked at me without surprise, as if she had expected I would return. The rain outside fell steadily, tapping the windows like hesitant applause. I asked her to recount that final evening. She hesitated. The words she chose were cautious, each phrase weighed before release. Mrs. Carrow, she said, had dined alone. No one had accompanied her. A letter lay on the table. Catherine had not seen the envelope's contents, only the slight crease in the paper, the way it had been folded. A gesture, she suggested, that might carry more meaning than the letter itself. I listened, noting how she avoided speaking directly of what the widow had done with that letter. Instead, Catherine spoke of small acts. The adjustment of a curtain, the careful placement of a book, the lingering at the window as if waiting for a voice to call from the street below. I observed her hands, pale, thin, and trembling slightly, and thought of the faint underlining in Donne and Herrick. The widow's attention to detail had been precise, almost obsessive, and perhaps it was these small choices that had left traces we had yet to interpret. She mentioned doctor, veil in passing. A glance exchanged in the corridor, a comment about overdue debts, nothing remarkable to any casual observer. Yet Catherine's recollection carried an unease. Vale's presence was felt in the room without the formality of introduction. She had noticed the subtle way he lingered near the bookshelf, adjusting a volume of Cicero before leaving. It was the sort of detail easily dismissed, yet I had learned that in Oxford, gestures speak louder than confessions. When I pressed about Mrs. Carrow's companions or possible visitors, Catherine grew quieter. She spoke of a knock at the door that had not been answered, and of a shadow passing outside the window, reflected only in the glass. Perhaps it was the wind, perhaps not. Catherine admitted she had been too engrossed in her music to investigate. The modesty of her own silence seemed to protect a truth she did not dare to voice. I remarked on the letter again. She confessed that the envelope had borne no stamp, though it was addressed in careful script. Unsigned, unposted, a message perhaps intended to remain private, or a gesture performed for an unseen witness. The very ambiguity of it suggested something beyond suicide, beyond blackmail, beyond any neat categorization. And then, slowly she recalled Mrs. Carrow at the window, drawing the curtains so that the afternoon light fell unevenly upon the room, not the way the maid had left them, not the way one might expect. Catherine remembered the gesture because it was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it unsettled her. The curtains, she said, seemed to be signalling something, though neither she nor I could be certain what. I did not press further. The fragments she offered were enough. Memory is not evidence, strictly speaking, but in a case built on nuance and half-gestures, it is a compass, however unreliable. Catherine rose then, glancing at the piano one last time. "Inspector," she said, "some melodies are unfinished. We play what we can, then leave the rest to silence." She was careful not to add anything more, but the metaphor lingered as I watched her retreat down the corridor. The room, left empty, smelled faintly of wax and old paper, of tea long gone cold. I thought of Mrs. Carrow alone in room 14, her actions half remembered by another, her intentions partly obscured by the delicate curtain of memory, and I realized that in this case the smallest gestures, a note folded just so, a curtain drawn differently, a pencil mark on a page, were already speaking louder than any confession ever could. Dr. Marcus Vale had a habit of speaking as if each sentence were borrowed from some lost manuscript, deliberate, laboured, and just shy of confession. I found him in the Randolphs' library, surrounded by tomes whose weight seemed to mirror his own. The evening had fallen into a muted drizzle, and the light from the street lanterns struck the tall windows at a slant that lent the room an uneasy warmth. He welcomed me with a nod and a faint, sardonic smile. "Inspector," he said, "I imagine you come for my sins. Perhaps, but I do not correct the tone of our conversation. There is an odd honesty in a man who does not deny his reputation, however darkly." Vale had been acquainted with Mrs. Carrow, he admitted, though the precise nature of their connection was a tangle of years and circumstance. She had trusted him briefly with a matter of some delicacy. I pressed gently on what he meant by delicacy. He fumbled with the cuff of his sleeve as though the fabric could hide what words could not. "Some debts," he said, "are both monetary and moral. One cannot always distinguish which weighs more." I observed him closely. His apartment had that faint scent of whiskey and old paper, the smell one carries when both have become habits of survival. He spoke of Mrs. Carrow's loneliness, of the small kindnesses he had offered, and of the letters she had written him, but never sent. His voice trembled at intervals, betraying a man who had measured consequence too late. I asked him about the evening of her death. He paused, and then, in that half-confession that has become his habit, said he had visited the Randolph, but left before the hour in which she was found. He mentioned seeing the curtains drawn differently than before, an observation that had escaped the maid, yet one that struck me immediately. Vale did not claim to know why, only that the gesture had seemed deliberate. There was a book on the table, Cicero this time, worn at the spine. He gestured to it. "I always return to familiar texts when uncertain," he said. Not unusual for a man steeped in classics, but the phrase carried weight. Uncertain not in scholarship, but in moral footing. I pressed further. The letters, the visits, the small kindnesses, did they amount to influence? He shook his head. "No," he said, "only proximity. Only that, by being there, he had witnessed gestures and words that now seemed strange. His tone suggested that, in observing, he had become implicated, though by accident rather than intention. I noted the faintest detail, a pencil mark on a page of Cicero, corresponding to the same section of text Mrs. Carrow had underlined in her Don. A coincidence, perhaps. but the rhythm of the lines matched. I mentioned it, quietly. Vale's eyes flickered, and I knew then that his attentiveness had crossed into participation. He confessed at last, though not fully. He had been aware of a plan, vague yet urgent, that Mrs. Carrow entertained. A plan interrupted by circumstance, a plan left incomplete. The letters, the notes, the unposted correspondence, all pieces of a puzzle whose edges he could not fit together. We spoke then of contradictions, the subtle inconsistencies that pepper human behaviour. Vale admitted he had lied about minor matters, no more than shadows on a wall, yet the shadows mattered. They traced a path through the widow's final days, a path not wholly comprehensible, but unmistakably present. As he concluded, I sensed his fatigue, the kind born not of exertion but of conscience stretched too thin. He did not seek absolution. He sought only the acknowledgement that observation, however passive, can still carry moral weight. I left him in the library, the rain tapping at the windows like a tentative rhythm. Outside, Oxford held its quiet melancholy, its spires glimpsed through the mist. I thought of Mrs. Carrow, of letters folded and left unsent, of curtains drawn and redrawn, and of a man who had witnessed both and lived with the consequence. The puzzle pieces were beginning to shift. Vale's confession did not solve them, but it allowed their edges to breathe, and sometimes in Oxford, breathing is the first step toward understanding. The Randolphs' room 14 had grown familiar in my mind, though the familiarity was a brittle one, like walking on frost. Each visit revealed more shadows than substance, and yet, in those shadows, truths quietly nested. The curtains had first drawn my attention, heavy, velvety drapes that seemed to resist the intrusion of daylight. The maid had insisted she left them neatly aligned, yet something in their present arrangement suggested deliberation. Slightly askew, just enough to cast light across the nightstand at a particular angle. I examined the letter again. Folded, unposted, its edges crisp. The handwriting was small, precise, and almost painfully careful. I unfolded it slowly, as if the paper itself would whisper a secret if treated with enough patience. The words were cautious, courteous, yet there was an urgency beneath the lines, a silent insistence that the reader understand before it was too late. I remembered the misquoted line in Don. Ever so subtle, a single word altered. It was the sort of discrepancy a casual observer might miss entirely, yet it hinted at intention. I traced the underlined phrase with my finger, noting the way the pen had paused mid-stroke, as if the writer reconsidered meaning in the very act of marking it. The combination of letter and poem formed a pattern, though the pattern was faint, like a watermark visible only in particular light. The piano teacher's recollection came unbidden. Catherine had noted the curtain's adjustment, the way the widow lingered at the window. Not for herself, she had thought, but perhaps for someone unseen, a visitor, a witness, or merely an echo of anticipation. In Oxford, I had learned that anticipation, like grief, can act as a subtle architecture, shaping actions more rigidly than law or circumstance. I considered Dr. Vale's admission fragmentary as it had been. He had observed, he had noted, he had almost confessed, yet his awareness was limited. He had not acted. Observation, I realized, is a curious thing. One can be entirely complicit in its results without ever lifting a hand. I returned to the curtains. The drapery's displacement was slight, a deviation from symmetry that might suggest nothing to a stranger. Yet to one attuned to detail, a detective or a poet, perhaps both, the gesture spoke volumes. Combined with the letter, the underlined line, the pencil marks in the book, the scene began to form a lattice. It was fragile, almost invisible, yet unmistakably present. I moved toward the nightstand, noting the angle of the lamp and the faint residue of wax on its base. There was a candle, partially burnt, faintly familiar in its position. Sister Miriam had tended to similar candles in the chapel, though she would never admit it. The coincidence suggested a shared ritual, or a visit unnoticed by others. Small habits, I reminded myself, often outlast intention. The letter's final lines pressed upon me. They did not command, nor beg, nor instruct. They suggested, almost like a whisper, consider carefully. Look where light falls, attend to that which is misplaced. The widow had written for someone, yet addressed no one. She had constructed a riddle not merely of words, but of action. The misalignment of curtains, the folded letter, the underlined poem, all elements intended to communicate, to reveal, yet to conceal in equal measure. In the corner of my mind, Catherine's eyes returned, watchful, cautious, yet perceptive. She had noticed, I realized, what most would have dismissed. The gestures mattered to her, though she could articulate none of their import. I left room 14 slowly, retracing the path along the corridor as rain tapped lightly against the window. The pieces were subtle, their edges delicate, yet they spoke to a pattern invisible to those unwilling to linger. In Oxford, the small and quiet gestures, a curtain drawn slightly, a line underlined incorrectly, a candle left burning, often mattered more than any confession. And so, the room remained, suspended between action and memory, its secrets half hidden in plain sight. Detective work, I have often observed, thrives in the quiet interstices between observation and thought, and it was Lewis who first drew my attention to one such interval. He had been reviewing the Randolph's guest register again, pencil hovering over the lines as though reluctant to commit to ink. I watched him silently, seated across from him in the lounge, while rain pressed steadily against the mullioned windows. He paused at room 14. There was nothing immediately remarkable, the usual details of arrival and departure, names scrawled in varying degrees of legibility. Yet his gaze lingered on the widow's signature. Then he muttered, almost to himself, that the time of her departure and the hour noted by the maid did not quite align. Slightly off, he said, the sort of discrepancy that might be dismissed as clerical error. I leaned closer, noting the pencil marks. Indeed, there was a faint, almost imperceptible smudge beside the recorded time of checkout. Someone had hesitated, then altered it. The detail alone did not reveal motive, yet it suggested careful manipulation. I had learned long ago to respect such hesitations. In Oxford, even minor alterations can speak as loudly as declarations. Lewis's next observation was subtler. The letter on the nightstand, he noted, bore traces of wax from the partially burnt candle. He suggested the envelope had been handled more than once, perhaps in haste or perhaps in rehearsal. The impression of fingertips was faint, yet unmistakable, small ridges pressed into paper by intention or anxiety. I considered the candle itself. Its placement, the residual wax, the angle at which it had leaned, all seemed trivial until assembled with the other elements of room 14. A slight adjustment here, a careful fold there. Mrs. Carrow had constructed a stage, however private, upon which her final act could unfold. Lewis's eyes brightened with cautious satisfaction. He had seen the trace of intent where others would have perceived accident. We spoke then of the guests. Catherine Ashwell, for instance, had observed the curtain's adjustment, and Dr. Vale had noted her unposted letters. Both pieces, when combined with the register's discrepancies, began to outline a subtle choreography. Someone had been conscious of observation, of potential witnesses, and had acted to guide their perception. I asked Lewis if he thought this suggested foul play. He hesitated, as he always did, before framing his thoughts. Not necessarily, he said, but it indicates premeditation in conduct, whether conscious or not. A crime may not have been committed, but the theatre was prepared. That phrase struck a chord. In Oxford, I reminded myself, preparation often precedes revelation, and revelation frequently arrives in fragments. Then he added another observation, almost as an afterthought. The pencil marks in Cicero and Herrick. Vale had noticed them, yes, but only by cross-reference could one see the pattern emerge. Pencils, paper, candles, curtains, the language of subtle communication. Each guest, in observing, had participated in a network of attention, a lattice built from small, deliberate acts. Lewis looked at me and smiled faintly, the sort of smile earned by patience and keen eye. He said, "I think we have overlooked the simplest detail. It's always the smallest gesture, Inspector, the one no one expects to be significant, the one that seems almost invisible." I knew, as I listened, that he was right. The misalignment of a curtain, the unposted letter, the penciled underlines. These were the gestures that mattered, the very gestures that would allow a careful mind to reconstruct the unseen logic of room 14. It was not merely observation, it was understanding the language of intention. The rain had stopped by the time we rose. The lounge seemed quieter, the hotel itself suspended in anticipation. Lewis's insight had not resolved the mystery nor revealed a culprit, but it had illuminated the paths along which truth might travel. And in Oxford, where shadows and light weave so intricately, to illuminate a path is often as vital as walking it. I stepped into the corridor, leaving Lewis to his notes, and for the first time the patterns in room 14 seemed less abstract, less distant. The lattice was visible, and somewhere within it lay the answer, awaiting the careful extraction of one willing to read each gesture with patience and precision. Room 14 had lingered in my mind like a faint scent, impossible to locate precisely yet unmistakable once noticed. I returned there alone, late in the afternoon, the hotel unusually silent, the rain having left the streets slick with reflections of Oxford's spires. The light filtered through the half-drawn curtains in slender tremulous bands, and for the first time I allowed myself to see the room as Mrs. Carrow might have intended, a space of subtle signals and private ritual. The letter lay as it had been left, folded neatly, corners aligned with meticulous care. I picked it up, noting the pencil markings in Don's verse, the almost imperceptible misquotation. Each word, each stroke of ink, carried meaning beyond its immediate sense. The misquotation, I realized, was not error but guide, a nudge toward careful attention, toward noticing what others might dismiss. The candle had long since burned out, but its wax remained on the nightstand, faintly impressed with the ridges of a fingertip. The curtains, though still slightly misaligned, now seemed deliberate in their asymmetry, directing the light toward the letter and the underlined poetry. A composition of gesture, a choreography designed for eyes that could read it. I thought of the guests. Vale, cautious and anxious, had observed without acting. Catherine, attentive to detail, had registered minor deviations. Arkwright, polished and poised, had carried traces of others' presences without acknowledging them, and Sister Miriam, elusive and devout, had left faint signs of her watchfulness. All had participated unknowingly, yet each gesture had left evidence, a lattice of intention and attention woven across the hotel, and then the envelope revealed its final whisper. Hidden beneath its flap, a folded page bore a brief diary entry, addressed not to any living recipient, but to memory itself. Mrs. Carrow wrote of fear, of isolation, of the knowledge that her days would be measured not merely by hours but by subtle choices, the alignment of curtains, the pencil underlining, the unposted correspondence. She acknowledged her loneliness, yet framed it in terms of responsibility, to leave traces of herself, to create signs intelligible only to careful observers. The realization came gradually, like the slow tilting of a window to catch the last sunlight of autumn. Mrs. Carrow had constructed a private testament, a secret encoded in the language of gesture, in the small deviations of habit and the punctuation of ordinary objects. Death itself had been anticipated, yet not revealed in conventional form. The room, the letter, the poetry, the candle, all were elements of a narrative written in silence. I felt a pang of melancholy. The widow's death, while at first seeming ordinary, was instead a careful orchestration of final control. There was no villainy, no malice, only the subtle assertion of autonomy in a world where she had been otherwise invisible, and yet the lattice of her interactions, the hints left, for those perceptive enough to notice, made her absence a presence more potent than the living might command. I lingered by the window, listening to the faint stir of wind against the stone. I thought of Oxford itself, the weight of history, the accumulation of secrets, the hushed corridors where shadows remember more than their owners. I thought of Lewis, tirelessly connecting fragments, and of the guests, each flawed, each human, each unknowingly complicit in a drama of delicate significance. For a moment, I imagined Mrs. Carrow watching from beyond, satisfied that her story would be read by the observant, though not understood by all. The faint misalignment of curtains, the deliberate pencil strokes, the unposted letter. These were her voice. I left room 14 quietly. The key returned to its holder with no sound. The hotel corridors were empty, yet the room's subtle orchestration lingered behind me, like the echo of a carefully struck piano note fading into air. Outside, the last light fell across the spires, gilding them in amber, and I understood that some secrets are meant to be seen, and yet never fully known. As I walked toward the street, I thought of the lattice, the letters, the gestures, the poetry. The mystery was resolved, yet unresolved in its beauty and restraint. The widow had commanded her narrative with intelligence, with grace, and with a quiet ache that resonated far beyond her passing. And so, the story of room 14 remained, a private testament of presence in absence, of intention in subtlety, of life articulated through silence. I paused at the corner of the street and, as the last breath of light faded, I murmured to myself that in Oxford, as in life, the smallest gestures often speak the loudest.